In this section, we're going to take our graphic that we built for our network graph, and we're going to work on the user interaction layer. We're going to add the transition and the handle user gesture. The first thing we want to do is, if I want to see the results better on my network chart, and you see there's a lot of results here. So I want to drag one of the node. I want to be able to drag it, and then you see how it bounce back in a spring mechanical way. So I want to be able to allow every small node to be drag and drop, and the same with the main, with the main node, with the parent node. I want to be able to drag it, and this is just helpful when you have a lot of them. So here we have only two, but imagine you have a lot of network graph that has a lot of nodes and they're connected with each other. So we want to be able to do that. We also want to be able to select. See, I clicked on the link and I was able to select the link, or on a question, and I'm able to select a question by clicking on the node itself. So we want to build that interactivity in this section. So also, the last thing we want to do, we want to be able to zoom. See how I was able to zoom in and zoom out. So for example, if I don't see the result too well, I want to be able to just, use my mouse, and with the mouse use the zoom capability. The first place we're going to start is, let's look at that at the node, and let's add some code to be able to drag and drop those. If you open up the simple force graph component, you can see where we left last time. In our last lesson, what we did, we created the links, the circles, and the labels. Now, the circles, that's what creates us the parent and the node circles. So we want to add that interactive to our circles. Luckily for us, D3 has a method that just handles that. So what we can do is we can create functions, and we can call it restart drag and stop drag. So this way we can start and restart our drag mechanism, and we can stop that. And inside the method, what we need to do, we need to use the simulation. So the first thing we need to check is, we need to make sure that the simulation was set, because the simulation, if you remember, if we go back to our member, it could be undefined. We set it that it's possible to be undefined, so we don't have to define it when we first initiate the class. So what we need to do is, we need to make sure that the simulation is up and running and was set. If the simulation is up and running, the simulation, we set it as a private member, and the reason that we set it as a private member is so we can access it in our code. And this is a great example. If you use the alpha target and you do restart, the alpha target needs to be, and we set it, for example, with a value, and then we give it the restart. That will allow us to set our mechanical spring simulation and get it restart on every time there's a drag. And the same with the stop. First of all, we need to make sure that the simulation is up and running. And if the simulation is, the formatting is the hardest part, right? And then if the simulation is up and running, we can use the simulation, and then we can just say alpha target is 0. Now, to better understand this whole alpha target thing, if you look into the actual class of our simulation, you can see that the alpha target is really, that's the alpha decay, and it does the interpolation to decide how to simulate our simulation. And the values are going to be between 1 and 0. And then when we set it with the value, it will create that interpolation for a simulation. So we basically were enabling to rerun the simulation when we decide to do a restart, and we stop the simulation when we do the stop. And what we can do is, we can go back to the circle and then in our circle class that it ties to our JSX code, we can add a restart and a stop. So we can just do a restart drag and then tie to our this restart drag, and the same with the stop. So stop drag and tie it with our stop method, stop drag method. And then what we can do is we can go into our circle and create those elements as our property. So go into circles, and at the bottom we're gonna add those simulations. So restart and stop drag. For the restart, the type is going to be, it's a function, and we're not returning anything, so we can do a function that return void, and the same for the stop drag. Now we can create a function that will handle all those event listeners. So what we can do is we can create, we can call it set mouse events listeners, and we can use those methods and do some additional calculation with D3. So let's take a look. So now we have a function that can handle that, and then we can tie that function into our component did mount. So every time the component mount, we want to set our event listeners. So we can create a component did mount a lifecycle event, and then we can tie it to our set mouse event listeners. This way it's going to get called every time the component gets mounted. So the first thing is we want to have access to all the properties. So a good way to do it is we can just create a constant and call it prop equal this, and this is in class component. That's a nice way to avoid keep typing this. If you use class component, we mostly use function component, but there are little tricks that can really help you with React, so your code is a little bit neater. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to use D3 to select all of our nodes, so we can call them and attach those event handlers. So what we can do is we'll use select all, and we need to set all the elements that our circle is creating. Now if you look, our circle is returning a circle element that we created. We created a custom circle, and each one of those we gave them a class name of node. Remember that? So now here what we can do, when we select, we can select that node, and that's going to select all the elements that our circle component is cycling through. Now that we have all those elements, what we need to do is we need to call the d3 drag method. So we can do call and d3.drag, and then we need to tell d3 what kind of element we're dragging. So this is for TypeScript, so it doesn't throw errors for us. It needs to know. So we're dragging an SVG circle element, and then we need to tell the type. So for the type, we're gonna have to create a new type because what happened is D3 is adding more properties. If you remember, once it's creating our component, it's actually adding more properties. And the property that it ends, it's gonna have an X, Y, and an FY, and an FX. So we need to create that. So we can create another type, and we can call it dtom, and we need an X, Y. This way React D3 can extend our component, and we don't need to ignore it with the tsignore, because TypeScript would like to know what we're working with. And this comes out of the how D3 works. So you could look at the docs and really learn a little bit more about it. Then we need to disable, because we're using lowercase for the DTOM. So I'm disabling that. Okay. Now that we have the new type, we can tell D3, hey, the type is going to be DTOM. Okay. Next, and then now we can really set our events. What we can do is we can tell D3 what to do. So we can tell D3, hey, on, and then we can set our event. So for example, on a start event, let's just fix the errors first. It looks like D3 is not imported, so we need to import it. So import everything is D3 from D3. Another thing that it's complaining about, it doesn't like the ESLint that we're doing this call because it could be undefined. So I'm just gonna put in tsignore here. Okay, great. Now we need to set our events. So there's 3 events we're gonna be handling. They're gonna be the start, the drag, and the end drag. So drag and end drag. And what I can do is I can put in line of our constant those events. So I can call it on drag start. And I can pass it to my start event. And it expects 2 things. It expects the event type, and the event type is going to be D3 drag event. And it's going to expect the data that we're passing. And the data is going to be the DTOM we created. And then the same with the other functions. The formatting is really going crazy. So we have on drag start, we'll create another method, we can call it on drag, and another method on drag end. And then since the ID doesn't let me import the D3 drag event, I'm gonna have to do it manually. So just import D3 drag event from D3. And let's make sure that we don't, let's get rid of any errors we have. We need to tell D3 drag event to get rid of the ESLint. We need to tell the type that we're going to be expecting, which is going to be SVG circle element. There you go. And it doesn't like we're doing this inline function. So let's get rid of that. And I need to close the call. I didn't close the call. And then another thing, it's complaining here because the on drag and on drag end, the drag and end event, it's expecting 3 arguments. We don't need to pass any other argument for our event. So what we can do is we can set it as never. As never is preferred than using any. The difference between the never and any is that any you're passing any type, and never we're telling ESLint that we're confident that we're not passing any other elements. And since we know we're not passing other element, we can tell D3 that this won't happen. The last thing we need to do, you see all those indentation, we need to fix those, so we get rid of ESLint errors. Okay, great. And now we can handle those event listeners. The first thing we're going to handle is that on drag start, and what we want to do is we want to make sure that the event is not active, because if the event is active we don't want to start another event, so we need to check if it's active. If it's not active, then what we can do is we can just pass this this method back to the restart drag that used the simulation to simulate the drag event for us, right? We need to do that, and then we need to do a couple more things. We need to set the data for the fx to be equal to the dx, because D3 expected in the simulation as fx. So we need to make sure that it gets what it expects. And the dy. So we need to extend it so D3 understand those values, otherwise it just won't work right. And it's complaining because we're assigning inside of a function, and we're doing it purposely so we can ignore those comments, because you're not really supposed to extend it like this, but we're using D3 and we want to let D3 do its thing. So it's important to kind of we have to ignore that. And then on the drag event, all we need to do is we need to assign the fx to our event x, and the same with the fy needs to be assigned to our event y. Okay, this is on the drag event, and then when the drag stop, this is it's complaining again because it doesn't want to reassign, but we're taking over the handler and we have to reassign, otherwise it won't work right. And when the drag stop ends, what we need to do is, again, we need to make sure we need to make sure that the event is not active currently. And if the event is not active, then what we want to do is we want to stop the drag. So we're going to pass it back to our parent component that will handle stopping the simulation drag, and then we want to set the fx to null and fy to null. Now let's go to localhost 3000. It looks like we get an error. It says no overload match the call at the simple first graph. Let's take a look. So let's go back to simple first graph, and yeah, this is an overload. We don't need to pass the parentheses, we just need to pass the method. And let's test it again. Restart. Okay, so when we reload it, okay, it looks like, you see, now it's working. We're able to kind of take our node and drag them, and when we let go, we got that spring mechanical effect, so that's great. Now that our node have mechanical effect, the next thing we want to do is we want to be able to click a label and see the results to pass it to our parent. So if you remember, we set up an on node selected prop that we're passing from our network widget parent, and what we can do is we can pass that to our to the labels component, and down to the label, so we can add that to the props we're using. And let's pass it on. So we need to pass it from the labels to the actual label. So in the label, we'll add it here. And on the label, we need to pass it as well. So this prop on node selected, and we need to pass the dispatcher all the way down to our label. So in our, we can, I guess we can create an interface here. So interface I, we don't have one. I label props, and then we can put the dispatcher, and we can put the node as well. And we can replace the object with our prop. Okay. And once the user click on any of the text, we want to be able to handle that. So we can just add it to our text element SVG. So on click event, and we can just do it in line. And we can just say that that once the user click it, we can just assign it to our props on node selected, and then we can pass the index. And the index is really, it's going to be our this props node, and the node is adding the index to it. So if we cast it as type index number, we can actually use the index that got added to each one of those elements. We need to wrap it in a bracket, and then I can call the index, and I may need to add an unknown. Let's take a look. Yeah, we need to add unknown conversion. And then it's because the index starts from 0, we need to pass the element -1. Okay. And that will pass the data back to our parent. And then one more thing that I want to add is for the text, we should add the style that we don't have the cursor, because we want to be able the user to click it. And if we have that cursor, right now it's like a text that you can copy the text, but what we really want to do, we want to set the cursor as a pointer. We don't want it as a text. So let's set that up. So we can just call put the style. You can put the style inside of the Sass. I'm just gonna put it here. So the style will be a pointer, so we know it's clickable, and then it's gonna pass it back to our labels, back to our simple graph, and back to our network widget. Now I want to point out that what we're doing here is prop drilling, because we're passing the selected method to the graph, then to the labels, and then to the actual label. So normally I would say let's refactor that and we can use Recoil, for example, to set that data. But since I want to really keep the code as simple as possible, we're going to leave it like that. But feel free to do a refactoring, and you can create an atom in Recoil and set that atom with that state, or you can use the context that built into React and then pass that through the context. Now inside of the network widget Sass file, I added for us two CSS styles that we can use. One, I call it wrap div. So we can wrap our div in a contain area of a width of 800 by 350 and clip art everything around it, and a selected text that I set the font size and the color once the user select. So let's apply those to our network widget. So for the selected index, let's add the class name is selected text, and we can wrap our simple force chart graph in a class name. I think we called it wrap div. And the parents, we don't need the div anymore. We can just put a tag. And let's take a look. Actually, wait, look what happened. The IDE collapses our div into a closing tag, so we gotta fix that first. Sometimes the IDE, again, it doesn't recognize those empty tags, and then it really messes everything up. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, now we have our all our node, and once I click them, it gives me the index that I selected. The last thing I want to add is zoom capability, and there's many ways we can go about it, but I'm going to use a simple approach that it's relatively new with the D3 version 6. So what we can do is, the first thing we need to do is we need to give our SVG identifier. So we can call it container, and that way we can select it. Then we can create another method, and let's call it add zoom capabilities. And then we can create a container and have it assigned to our D3, select container. And then we need to call this new method once the component mounted. So go up to the component did mount, and let's add that. Great. Now what we want to do is we want to create the zoom. So to create the zoom, we can also use D3. So let's create a constant. Let's call it zoom. And we can use D3. D3, it's really, they made it really simple. All you have to do is you need to call the zoom method, just like you call, other method when we do an interactivity. So that tells D3 that we're starting, to set a zoom. And then we need to set the scale that we want to extend. And we need to pass it an array. So for example, I can say, hey, from 1 to 8, that's the scale that I want to do it. And the scale, how I want to translate once we extend. So once we extend, we need to pass, needs to be inside an array. Okay. And in the extent, it expects two arrays for the start and end. And we can tell it how to extend. And we can also, this needs to be an array. And inside of our array, the ID just does whatever it wants. We can pass two arrays. So we can set them up to 100 by 100 and 200 by 200. You can play around with those values and see how it changes your zoom. And then we want to also tell it that we want an on zoom event. So once the user wants to do a zoom, we want to make sure that D3 will handle that, and we can tell D3 how to handle that. So we can create our what to do with it. So it takes three property x, y, and k, and that equal that we're taking it from the transform. So the event will have a transform, the listener, and then we can take those properties and tell D3 how to handle it. So once there's a zoom event, we want the x0, y0, and the k multiply equal 1. What I'm saying is I don't want to move the x and y, I just want to move the zoom. So that's how I'm setting it, and then we can call our container and set the attribute of the transform to the translate that with the setting that I'm setting here. So it's going to look like this. It's going to be translate, and I can pass in the X, Y, and again, you can play with those too. If you want the zoom to move, then you would change the X and Y. But here what we want to do is we just want to do a scale. So what we do is we can just call the X, Y, and then our scale will be that K element. And then for the width and height, we need to set that here too, because it's every time it's going to do a translate. So we need to make sure it's done correctly. So we can add another attribute for the X and Y. So we'll do it here. For the width and height, sorry, not the X and Y. So width will be equal approx width, oops, and our height will equal our props height, and that's it. This should do it. Now the only thing we have left to do is we need to use the call method, so it's going to assign those properties. So just do container that call and pass the zoom element, and that will assign all that stuff we created. Let's see, it's complaining because it says it's not aligned because it's incompatible. So instead of going with some crazy TypeScript assigning, I'm just going to use ts-ignore because I don't want to go through some crazy casting with D3 and TypeScript. Now reload localhost and let's try it. It's look like it's not working. Yeah, it's giving me event transform. You see, there's an error. So we need to fix that. Let's take a look. Yeah, you see there's a typo, transform. I told you this before, 9 out of 10 when you see issues, it's with the transform because it fails silently, and then you really don't know why. This time, luckily, it told us that, hey, you're trying to assign something that doesn't exist. There's no transform on event. But watch out for those things because it can really take some time to debug and figure out what's going on. Let's take a look. Okay, let's see. I'm going to reload localhost. Yep, now it's working. See, I'm using my trackpad to zoom in and out, and I can go to any location I want. And you can play around with the zoom and those values. You'll see how to work with it. There's other ways we can zoom. We can actually create a little widget here that will allow us to zoom in, zoom out, move the map. We can do all of that stuff, but I'm not going to show you that. I just want to show you simple zoom functionality.